Researchers believe they have uncovered the first clear example of a treasure the ancient Egyptians brought home with them from the legendary lost land of Punt. It is a 3,300-year-old baboon skull, a remnant of animal that was revered in ancient Egypt but was not native to the land of the pharaohs. The legendary treasures of Punt. The ancient Egyptians wrote about the land of Punt and depicted it as a prosperous location from 2450 BC to 1155 BC. They went to Punt, which they referred to as God's land, to acquire gold, African blackwood, ebony, ivory, aromatic raisins, wild animals, and slaves. One of the most famous artworks created about this location is the Punt Colonnade on Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari, demonstrating that her people brought her myrrh trees, gold, ivory, panther skins, and apes back from Punt. The travels to Punt for treasures also demonstrate the ancient Egyptians' nautical skills. Nathaniel Dominy, a primatologist at Dartmouth College and lead author of the new study, explained that the long-distance seafaring between Egypt and Punt, two sovereign entities, was a major milestone in human history because it drove the evolution of maritime technology. Trade in exotic luxury goods, including baboons, was the engine behind early nautical innovations. Archaeologists believe that the land of the Punt was a real place. However, there is still a debate about where it was actually located. Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia are just a few of the proposed locations. This is why researchers have taken a particular interest in the 3,300-year-old baboon skull. If this baboon really did come from Punt, and they could identify its homeland, the mystery may be solved. Dominy states in a press release, "Many scholars view trade between Egypt and Punt as the first long maritime step in a trade network known as the Spice Route, which would go on to shape geopolitical fortunes for millennia." Other scholars put it more simply, describing the Egypt-Punt relationship as the beginning of economic globalization. Baboons were central to this commerce, so determining the location of Punt is important. For over 150 years, Punt has been a geographic mystery. Dominy says, "Our analysis is the first to show how mummified baboons can be used to inform this enduring debate." Analyzing the baboon skull. Even though there are records and artwork listing and depicting the goods Egyptians took from Punt, Science magazine reports that archaeologists have found little hard evidence for treasures from Punt to date. Dominy and his colleagues believe that their research will change that. They identified a Hamadryas baboon skull tucked away in the British Museum's archives and think that the fossil that was discovered in Thebes, Luxor, in the 19th century came from Punt. The results of their study, published on eLife, explains that they studied the chemical isotopes in the baboon's tooth enamel to try to pinpoint the animal's birthplace. Isotopic analysis is a useful tool for this endeavor because different places have distinct ratios of strontium isotopes in the soil and water, and this isotopic signature of the place where the animal lives the first years of their life is seen in their tooth enamel, thanks to the water they drink and the foods they consume. No matter where the animal lives later in life, their homeland's isotopic signature remains in their tooth enamel, unaltered by time. The results of the chemical analysis of the baboon skull show that the animal wasn't born in Egypt. In their paper, the researchers write that it came from a region that it encompasses much of present-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti, and portions of Somalia and Yemen. They write that this region corroborates the balance of scholarly conjecture on the location of Punt, and also is a testament to the tremendous reach of Egyptian seafaring during the 2nd millennium BC. Dominy says that this implies the baboon is the first known Puntite treasure. According to Science magazine, Catherine Bard, an archaeologist at Boston University, said that the baboon skull study provides another piece of evidence on where Punt was located. Bard believes that Punt is either in Eritrea or eastern Sudan. She also tells Science magazine that this isn't the first example of a treasure from Punt, because her excavations at Mersa Wadi Gawasis unearthed obsidian ebony fragments, which she asserts came from Punt. Domini disagreed, saying that ebony, for example, was widely distributed across Africa, so Bard's discovery was not necessarily a treasure from Punt. The ancient Egyptians linked Hamadryas baboons to their god of wisdom and the creator of hieroglyphics, Thoth, and Amun-Ra, the sun god. They considered the animals sacred and depicted them in their sculptures, reliefs, and paintings, even though they're not native animals to Egypt. Egyptologist Dr. Geraldine Pinch has also noted that baboons were connected with Duat, the underworld in ancient Egyptian religion, saying, "The image of the Thoth baboon beside a Wedjat eye occurs on magic wands as early as the 20th century BC. Two baboon form of the god Khons control the Book of the End of the Year. These contain lists of those who were destined to die and those who would live." Anaut Balaji has written that baboons were associated with ancient Egyptian kings too. For example, King Nama is shown as being transformed into a baboon known as the Great White One, as part of a rejuvenation festival scene. Bajaji noticed that some scholars opine that the title of this god is derived from the silver-grey mane of a dominant Hamadryas, and individual ancestors were ritually deified in the form of baboons and received cultic offerings. When archaeologists were excavating a dried-up lagoon known as Mersa Gawasis, they discovered traces of an ancient harbour that had helped launch early voyages, like Hatshepsut's, onto the open ocean. Man-made caves in the area contain timber, rigging, limestone anchors, steering oars, reed mats, cedar planks, and the remains of one of the oldest sea-going ships ever discovered. These artifacts have offered proof of the Egyptians' nautical skills and also provided important clues to the location of Punt. A more recent discovery adds weight to the evidence that Punt was located somewhere in Africa and not on the Arabian Peninsula. Science in Poland reports that archaeologists and ornithologists have identified a depiction of a bird on the portico of Punti in the Temple of Hatshepsut as a secretary bird, Sagittarius serpentarius, a very large bird of prey found only in Africa, particularly around coastal regions in Sudan. For centuries, the land of Punt has been delegated to the realm of myth and folklore, but more and more recent findings are making it clear that Punt was not a mythical place, it's a real location that is still waiting to be found. A spectacular recent find from Kenya by Meave Leakey of the National Museum of Kenya and her colleagues has caused controversy in the scientific world. The find, a damaged but almost complete skull and face, is claimed to be 3.5 million years old and belonged to an entirely new breed of early human. However, many scientists have objected to this identification due to apparent damage to the fossil, and the debate over whether it is indeed a new species is still continuing. Born on the 28th of July 1942 in London, English paleoanthropologist Dr. Meave Leakey is part of a family that has gained worldwide renown for decades of pioneering hominin research in Eastern Africa. She is the daughter-in-law of Lewis and Mary Leakey and wife of Richard Leakey, the famous paleontologists who have made several significant hominid finds in the last 50 years. In 2002, Meave Leakey, along with her daughter Louise, was named an Explorer in Residence by the National Geographic Society. In 2007, Leakey was a lead author of a study in the journal Nature that went against the predominant view of the ancestral lineage of Homo sapiens, namely that the species Homo habilis evolved into Homo erectus in linear succession. Currently, Dr. Leakey is a research professor in the Department of Anthropology, Stony Brook University, New York, director of Pleistocene research at the Turkana Basin Institute, Kenya, explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, and co-leader with her daughter Louise of the Kubifora Research Project, the KFRP. In 2001, Meave and her daughter Louise and colleagues reported on the discovery of a 3.5 million-year-old skull that they believed belonged to a previously unknown hominin genus and species, the Kenyan flatface. Research assistant Justus Eris had made the find 2 years earlier while working with members of the Leakey family near the Lomkwi River in northern Kenya. The almost complete skull was battered and weathered, but for the Leakleys, cleverly represented a new breed of early human. It is the oldest near-complete human skull ever found. For the previous 2 decades, scientists had believed that a species better known as Lucy, named after the partial Ethiopian skeleton discovered in 1974, was our single common ancestor. Meave and Louise's discovery apparently demonstrated that humans did not descend from Lucy, and that, rather than a neat ancestral line linking us to chimps, there were likely numerous species of hominids living at the same time. According to Meave, the find was significant because it showed us that the situation was a lot more complex than we thought. Whilst Lucy was able to walk upright, she had an ape-like projecting mouth and heavy brow. The newly discovered skull, the only one of its kind so far identified, however, has a much flatter face and raised cheekbones. The brow is smaller and teeth are intermediate between typical human and typical ape forms, with fairly small molars compared to Lucy and her later relatives. Dr. Leakey said of the huge importance of the find, "This shows persuasively that at least 2 lineages existed as far back as 3.5 million years. The early stages of human evolution are more complex than we previously thought." Kenyan flat-faced man still had a long way to go in terms of brain power, however, possessing a brain cage no bigger than a modern chimp. The new find is said to come from a completely new genus, though this new group may, according to some researchers, already have 2 members. They have noted that the features exhibited look very similar to those of a skull discovered in 1972 on the eastern shore of Lake Turkana in the Kenyan Rift Valley by Meave Leakey's husband Richard. The skull, named 1470 Man, had a very human-like face, flat rather than protruding like an ape, and with small teeth. The age of 1470 Man was controversial for many years. It's believed by most researchers to be around 1.8 million years old and is assigned to the species Homo rudolphinus, usually regarded as a very primitive member of our own lineage. However, a few people believe the skull should not be attributed to Homo rudolphinus and needs to be re-examined. In Leakey's studies of the finds published in 2012, she stated that the specimen from Lake Turkana is a different species from the early Homo varieties previously known to have inhabited the area. These were Homo habilis, handyman, the assumed tool user, conventionally seen as the earliest known Homo species, and Homo erectus, the upright man, thought to be a direct ancestor of our own species. According to Leakey, with these new fossils we can definitely say there are 2 groups of non-erectus living side by side at Lake Turkana, as opposed to other species of Homo which had rather protruding faces. What would have struck you was how flat and broad the face was. Their brain case is beginning to get a little bit of a forehead because it's quite a big brain in there, but nothing like the brain of Homo erectus, which likely arose later. The study team wanted to avoid the previously proposed names for the flat-faced species Homo rudolphinus, as the relationships between the fossil specimens and the species names is still uncertain. The study team wanted to avoid the previously proposed name for the flat-faced species Homo rudolphinus, as the relationships between the fossil specimens and the species names is still uncertain. One fascinating question is how the 3 early humans would have coexisted without friction over food supplies, for example, existing between them. According to physical anthropologist William Kimball, given the facts that they were all terrestrial bipeds of one sort or another, differences in how the 3 species made a living and where they chose to live would have come down to diet, as opposed to, say, climbing ability. Perhaps it may just be that these early human species simply had no problems getting along with each other. Modern primates are generally very good at living together, Leakey commented. You can see troops of monkeys composed of at least 2 species, if not more. The study of the origins of man is understandably a controversial and complex area. Since Meave Leakey's initial discovery, the picture has been complicated even more by the identification in 2000 of a hominin now called Oronin tugenensis. This creature could represent an entirely new group of hominids, and is claimed to be the oldest human-like creature known to science, taking our lineage back to an astonishing 6 million years ago. In 2000, the research team of Bridget Sennett and Martin Pickford discovered fossil material consisting of a partial humerus, femur and mandible, a distant thumb bone and some teeth in the Tugen Hills of Kenya. The molars were covered with thick enamel like those of later hominins, and were small like our own. The discovery was nicknamed at the time Millennium Man due to its discovery date, and was dated to 6 million years ago and given the taxonomic classification Ororin tugenensis, original man from the Tugen Hills. Initially, paleoanthropologists were skeptical of the find, with many remaining so to this day, especially as the fossils were not made available to the scientific community. Although there is still a heated debate over the fossil, it is increasingly presented in published texts as hominin. Millennium Man lived around the time when genetic analysis suggests our oldest hominin ancestor split from the oldest ancestor of the great apes. This means there's a chance that Ororin tugenensis could be the fabled missing link, or at least one of them. In March 2003, paleontologist Tim White of the University of California, Berkeley, questioned the heritage of Meave Leakey's find. He argued that it was more likely to be a Kenyan variant of Lucy. White based his assertion on the fact that the cranium was cracked and distorted when discovered, making it possible that some of its apparently unique features, including its flat face and tall vertically oriented cheekbones, could have been caused by geological processes. Fred Spoor of the University College London, who was part of the team that found the Kenyan flat-faced man fossil, disputed such objections and made a new, detailed study of the skull. From examining computed tomography scans, Spoor concluded that the upper jaw had suffered much less distortion than the rest of the cranium. So he focused his studies on that bone, correcting for the distortion present, and concluded that Leakey and her colleagues had been correct in designating the fossil a new species. A mysterious small clay figurine of a human found in 1889 at Nampa, Idaho, has remained a controversial artifact since its discovery. As the figurine was found at a depth of 300 feet in a geological stratum that dates to around 2 million years ago, some researchers believe the culture that created it must have flourished at the same period. But according to conventional chronology, this is simply not possible. In 1887, 5 gentlemen, James A. Pinney, Nathan Falk, Joseph Perrault, John Bernard, and M.A. Kurtz, formed a company to locate artesian water at the new town of Nampa, southwest Idaho. By July of 1889, their sand pump had reached a depth of over 300 feet. According to Mr. Kurtz, he was at the sand pump checking the contents coming out when, in his own words, he had the clay image in his hand and supposed it was a twig. I dipped it into a barrel of water standing near, washed it off and saw at once what it was. The tiny baked clay artifact was about 1.5 inches long, in the shape of a human. American amateur geologist George Frederick Wright later wrote about the discovery in his book, The Origin and Antiquity of Man. The record of the well shows that they had penetrated first about 50 feet of soil, then about 15 feet of basalt, and afterwards passed through alternate beds of clay and quicksand, down to the depth of about 300 feet when the sand pump began to bring up numerous clay balls, some of them more than 2 inches in diameter, densely coated with iron oxide. 2 million years old. Wright went on to describe the mysterious figurine. It was a female figure and had the lifelike lineaments in the parts which were finished that would do credit to the classic centers of art. American archaeologists at the time noticed that the apparent similarities between the Nampa figurine and those of Upper Paleolithic Europe. But how had the figure ended up in a geological formation from the Pliocene-Pleistocene transition dating to approximately 2 million years ago? The oldest known example of a depiction of a human being is the Venus of Hohlfels from a cave in the Swabian Alps of Germany, which is dated to between 40,000 and 35,000 years ago. Does the incredibly ancient Nampa figurine challenge the evolutionary scenario, as some independent researchers have suggested? What mysterious culture existed in North America 2 million years ago who could have been sophisticated enough to craft such an object? Perhaps the figure shows that intelligent humans might have existed on Earth far earlier than originally believed by science. The Nampa figurine has been held up by some as a perfect example of an out-of-place artifact, objects found in contexts that are way out of sync with the accepted chronology of human history. For some researchers, such artifacts place a huge question mark against what we think we know of the world and its history. Some argue that these discoveries offer persuasive evidence that in remote antiquity, mankind was significantly more advanced than we could ever imagine. They insist that at various times in prehistory, we have reached a high level of civilization only for it to be subsequently destroyed without a trace by natural or man-made catastrophes. Two well-known examples of such out-of-place artifacts are the supposed fossilized human footprints discovered in the 1880s at the summit of Big Hill in the Cumberland Mountains in Jackson County, Kentucky, and an apparently man-made object enclosed in rock known as the Costco artifact, which to all intents and purposes resembles a modern spark plug. The Kozo artifact was initially believed by some to be more than 500,000 years old and belong to an unknown, impossibly old civilization. However, later research into the object concluded something entirely different. Two researchers believing the object to be relatively modern enlisted the help of the Spark Plug Collectors of America. They sent letters and copies of the X-rays of the artifact to 4 different spark plug collectors who had no knowledge of the case and had never seen the pictures before. The collectors independently came to the same conclusion. They were certain that it was a 1920s-era Champion spark plug, one that probably powered a Ford Model T, and had been modified possibly to serve the mining operations in the Kozo mountain range. The amount of decay in the artifact was an almost perfect match for the rates of decay that would occur in a spark plug from this era. So the Kozo artifact had been lying on a mountain for no more than 40 years and had not been encased in rock at all, but in a material composed mainly of hardened clay with a mixture of organic matter. Understandably, members of the scientific community do not support the extreme date for the Nampa figurine. For example, Michael Brass, in his 2002 book, The Antiquity of Man, of George Frederick Wright, which is so critical for those who believe that the figurine is really 2 million years old, has also been called into question and revealed to be highly suspect. Wright's contemporaries were highly critical of his writing and did not take his work seriously as science. D.J. Brinton wrote a book review of Wright's Man and the Glacial Period in the journal Science in 1892. In this review, he states, Dr. Wright's last example is the feeblest of all the Nampa image, a beautifully formed clay image of a female said to have been brought up from a depth of 300 feet in the holing of an artesian well at Nampo, Idaho. It is sad to destroy illusions, but when this same image with its story was laid before a well-known government geologist, and he at once recognized it's a clay toy manufactured by the neighboring Pocatello Indians. The person displaying it replied with engaging frankness, "Well, now, don't give me away." As if that were not enough, the well-known government geologist was in fact J.W. Powell, who wrote in Popular Science Monthly in 1893, "In the fall of 1889, the writer visited Boise City in Idaho. While stopping at a hotel, some gentlemen called on him to show him a figurine which they said had been found in sinking an artesian well in the neighborhood at a depth of more than 300 feet. It was claimed that this figurine had been brought up from the bottom of an artesian well while the men were working. When this story was told, the writer, Powell, he simply jested with those who claimed to have found it. He had known the Indians that live in the neighborhood had seen their children play with such figurines, and had no doubt that the little image had lately belonged to some Indian children, and said the same. While stopping at the hotel, different persons spoke about it, and it was always passed off as a jest, and various comments were made about it by various people, some of them claiming it had given them much sport. When Powell later read George Frederick Wright's book, he was extremely surprised to discover that Wright had obtained the Nampa figurine and that he had actually published it as evidence of the great antiquity of man in the valley of Snake River. A certain Mr. McGee also attacked the honesty of the supposed discoverers of the ancient artifact, Kurtz and Doofs. In the 1894 second edition of Man and the Glacial Period, George Frederick Wright repeats McGee's assertions. "It is a fact," says McGee, "that one of the best-known geologists of the world chanced to visit Nampa while the boring was in progress, and the figurine and the pretty fiction were laid before him. He recognized the figurine as a toy such as the neighboring Indians give their children and laughed at the story, whereupon the owner of the object enjoined secrecy, pleading, 'Don't give me away. I fooled a lot of fellows already, and I'd like to fool some more.'" What does the Nampa figurine represent? In the years since its discovery, a lot of research has been done into the culture of the Native Americans local to the area where the figure was found. These studies have found, as J.W. Powell stated 120 years ago, that small, fragile clay figurines like the ones discovered were common to these Native American tribes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The evidence overwhelmingly points to the Nampa figurine being a hoax, perpetrated at a time when such stunts were popular and people enjoyed their brief notoriety.
The scientific discovery of fossilized trees dating back more than 260 million years has shocked the scientific community. Together with other recently discovered fossilized plant and tree discoveries on Antarctica, these finds suggest something that should not be, that the world's coldest, driest continent was once green and forested. Amongst other things, scientists have had to come up with an explanation of how trees were able to survive within a few degrees of latitude of the South Pole itself, where it's dark for 6 months of the year. But what does all this mean for scientific theories about Antarctica? Will they have to be changed? An ancient forested Antarctica. Over 100 years ago, Royal Naval officer and explorer Robert Falcon Scott's ill-fated expedition to Antarctica discovered fossils of plants on the Beardmore Glacier less than 310 miles from the South Pole. The expedition's chief scientist, Edward Wilson, recorded these remarkable findings in his diary, writing that most of the bigger leaves were like beech leaves in shape and venation. At the time, these discoveries were dismissed by scientists as mistaken or exaggerated. We take it for granted that Antarctica has always been a frozen wilderness, but the ice caps only appeared relatively recently in geological history. One of the professor's most important fossil discoveries was made in the Transantarctic Mountains, where, high up on glaciated peaks, she and her team found a sedimentary layer packed full of fragile leaves and twigs. Analysis showed that these fossils were the remains of stunted bushes of beech, dating back to mere 3 to 5 million years old. Consequently, they were some of the last plants to have lived on Antarctica before the deep freeze set in. But other fossil discoveries from the continent reveal the incredible fact that truly subtropical forests existed on Antarctica during much earlier times, during the age of dinosaurs. According to Dr. Vanessa Bowman, who works with Francis at the University of Leeds, go back 100 million years ago, and Antarctica was covered in lush rainforests similar to those that exist in New Zealand today. We commonly find whole fossilized logs that must have come from really big trees. But the strangest and most inexplicable characteristic of these polar forests was their adaptation to the Antarctic light regime. Close to the pole, in winter, it is always night, while in the summer the sun shines even at midnight. Professor David Bierling of the University of Sheffield explained the problem that these Antarctic trees must have faced. During prolonged periods of warm winter darkness, trees consume their food store, and if this goes on for too long, they will eventually starve. To understand how these Antarctic trees survived against such seemingly insurmountable odds, Professor Bieling investigated the types of plants that once grew on Antarctica. What we did was grow seedlings of these trees in blacked-out greenhouses where we could simulate Antarctic light conditions. We also raised temperature and CO2 concentration to match ancient growing conditions. We found that trees made so much food during the summers that this eventually caused photosynthesis to slow down. As a result, they couldn't fully take advantage of the long hot summers for photosynthesis. So, Professor Bierling's experiments demonstrated that trees were able to cope extremely well with the highly unusual environment. These hardy ancient trees were also able to withstand alternating months of pure sunlight and darkness, before eventually succumbing to history's greatest mass extinction. The discovery of fossil trees. In 2016, Eric Gulbranson, a paleoecologist from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and his team discovered the oldest polar forest on record from the southern polar region. Although the forest has not yet been precisely dated, Gulbranson believes it probably flourished about 280 million years ago before being swiftly buried in volcanic ash, which fortunately preserved it down to the cellular level. In Gulbranson's words, "They're actually some of the best preserved fossil plants in the world. The fungi in the wood itself were probably mineralized and turned into stone within a matter of weeks. In some cases, probably while the tree was still alive. These things happen incredibly rapid. You could have witnessed it firsthand if you were there." Ancient fossil trees that date back 100 million years can also be found in a small part of Alexander Island on the west coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, with logs up to 23 feet high still standing upright. Incredibly, the roots of these coniferous trees are still attached to the carbonaceous soil deposits today. Scientists from Rice University in Houston, Texas, undertook research on fossilized from the Antarctic Peninsula, and were extremely surprised to discover that the region was covered in tundra up to 12 million years ago. The continent's gigantic ice sheets began forming about 38 million years ago, with the Antarctic Peninsula the last area to be covered in ice. There has always been controversy in the scientific community about how quickly this glaciation took place. Scientists have now determined the exact species of plant that existed on the Antarctic Peninsula 12 million years ago, and concluded from fossil record that there was a long, gradual process of glaciation over the peninsula. In 2018, more new forests were discovered by researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee on the frozen slopes of the Transantarctic Mountains. Here, they discovered gray rocks containing fossils from Antarctica's ancient forested past. The team discovered fossil fragments of 13 trees that are well over 260 million years old, showing that this forest flourished at the end of the Permian period, before the first dinosaurs walked the Earth. continent lie in wait.
Researchers in Turkey are about to embark on an excavation at the ancient site of Karahan Tepe, and they believe it's much older than Göbekli Tepe, the famous zero point of world history. If you were to ask any professor of history or even a self-respecting armchair archaeologist to name the oldest monument ever discovered, they would have all said Göbekli Tepe. But now, that answer might be Karahan Tepe, and this is creating a lot of excitement in archaeological circles. Karahan Tepe is said to be much older than Göbekli Tepe. Archaeologists have been working at the Karahan Tepe site, which is often called the sister site of Göbekli Tepe, since 1997. The site is located near Yagmulu and roughly 35 kilometers east of the 12,000-year-old Göbekli Tepe site. Over the years, archaeologists have made a series of amazing discoveries at the Karahan Tepe site. In particular, tons of buried T-shaped obelisks, similar to the ones carved with wild animals at Göbekli Tepe, have led researchers to conclude that Karahan Tepe is much older than its younger sister, Göbekli Tepe. Head of excavations at Karahan Tepe, Dr. Nesmi Karul, said that 12 spots estimated to be in the same period as Göbekli Tepe are now known in the region, one of which is the Karahan Tepe. Speaking at the 10th International Resort Tourism Congress, Culture and Tourism Minister Mehmet Nuri Ersoy said that an intensive and rapid excavation program continues in Karahan Tepe, which to date has yielded 250 obelisks featuring animal figures. Ersoy claims that planned excavations will prove the settlement at Karahan Tepe will be much older than the 12,000-year-old Göbekli Tepe. A 2016 National Geographic article recounted the fascinating story of the discovery and preservation of Göbekli Tepe. Professor Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist who led excavations at the site, argued before he died in 2014 that a vast labor force needed to build the enclosures, and that this construction project pushed people to develop agriculture as a way of providing predictable food and perhaps drink for workers. At the 2015 World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Turkey's Dogus Group announced that they plan to spend $15 million over the next 20 years in partnership with the National Geographic Society on the Göbekli Tepe site. And Dogus Group chairman Ferit Ihsanek said in a press release that the reason so much cash was being spent on Göbekli Tepe was because this prehistoric temple was the zero point in time. Karahan Tepe may well be Göbekli Tepe's older sister. While Göbekli Tepe holds the world record in media headlines and elsewhere as the earliest temple of its type ever discovered, there are several other contenders for this crown in Turkey. According to Jens Notroff, an archaeologist at the German Archaeological Institute who is working on Göbekli Tepe site, smaller versions of the pillars, symbols and architecture carved into stone at Göbekli Tepe have been found in settlements up to 125 miles away, including Karahan Tepe. Professor Notroff told National Geographic that Göbekli Tepe probably served the region as a cathedral, and therefore the surrounding sacred sites were like parish churches. The scientist also thinks hunter-gatherers traveled long distances to meet, worship, and help build new monumental structures through vast community projects that included grand feasts to display wealth. Returning to Karahan Tepe, according to a report in Daily Sabah, many more years of excavations and research must be conducted to determine what exactly it was used for. However, while it does happen, scientists seldom make big claims without equally big proof, and in this instance, the researchers think that when they ultimately get to Karahan Tepe's excavation center, it will be much older than 12,000 years. The archaeologists at Karahan Tepe are also convinced that they have a new zero point in world history. The mayor says the site will become a priority in place of Göbekli Tepe, and it will become a new focus of national, archaeological and tourist attention. Karahan Tepe is the sister to the enigmatic Göbekli Tepe that sits around 23 miles southeast of Göbekli upon an elevated limestone ridge. It has many striking similarities to Göbekli. Firstly, it consists of T-shaped pillars, 266 of them that mostly form parallel rows. The pillars have relief carvings, and the site appears, like Göbekli, to be deliberately buried under a great artificial mound, although this could be natural, as after 10,500 years of accumulation of dirt, combined with high winds, could have covered it back up. The comparisons do not end there. It also has serpent relief carvings, strange rock indentations, large cut marks, porthole stones, and an unfinished T-shaped pillar still in the quarry, the focus of this article. Karahan Tepe was first discovered in 1997 and was surveyed in 2000 and again in 2011. Like Göbekli Tepe, it's located within the boundaries of Sanliurfa, ancient Edessa, the birthplace of Abraham, around 30 miles from the city. It's not an officially recognized tourist site, so they had to plan their trip carefully as it was on private land upon the Tek Mountains. Fortunately, a well-placed, probably modern standing stone marked the entrance to the track that led to the farm that is located behind. When Andrew Collins visited there in 2004, the person who showed him around was warned he would get a beating if they found anyone had visited there. 10 years later, and the owners welcomed the occasional visitor with tea and information. No beatings entailed, just sweet hot beverages and conversation after the morning visit. The dating of the site is impressive, as it's dated to 8,500 BC, contemporary with the now submerged Navali Quarry and the later stages of Göbekli Tepe. There are obvious similarities to these and other sites in the vicinity, but we've heard that there was a quarry on site where an unfinished T-shaped pillar still sits within the bedrock. Kevin Fish diligently searched for it with only one clue, that it was directly to the west of the main enclosure, as mentioned in the 2011 report. Kevin eventually converged at the impressive monolith. It lies on a rock face sloping 30 degrees towards the setting sun. At 18 feet long, it would probably be the largest monolith at the site. The site is not excavated yet, so this can't be confirmed, and weighs in at around 30 to 40 tons. Its downward angle on the slope on natural exposed rock face may have been why this was a preferred spot to quarry from. As archaeologist Bahattin Selik explains, this is quite a practical technique, with roughly chiseling on the side of the rock to produce a T-shape, whilst carving the other side 40 centimeters wide and 1 meter deep. The solid pillar separated from the bedrock with this technique and can easily be removed from the quarry with the help of a slope. Andrew Collins decided to measure it and discovered it was indeed 18 feet, 5.5 meters in length, with a maximum width of 6.6 feet, 2 meters, across its T-shaped head. This is similar in size to the twin monoliths at the center of Göbekli's enclosure, C and D. The weathering was very bad, much like the exposed parts of the pillars on the main hill. However, what lies underneath could be as well preserved as Göbekli Tepe. Altogether, Karahan Tepe is a fascinating site that begs excavation, as the significance of the nearby Göbekli Tepe has now hit the headlines. After leaving the site, the visitor wondered if the location of the choice of rock was significant. Was the direction of the quarry from the main temple an indication of a tradition that existed as far back as 10,500 years ago? Andrew Collins discussed the possibility that, indeed, it could be the case, as bringing quarried stone from the west to the east may represent bringing it into the light, sunrise, from darkness, the sunset. However, the remaining 14-foot pillar still on the eastern slope had further avenues slightly further east of it, so again it showed a possible west to east movement. Alternatively, it could also represent an east-to-west direction from the smaller quarry to the main enclosure. After searching through some Masonic texts, a reference was found to a ceremony where the initiate had to move in that direction, east to west. Why this is perhaps could represent facing one's own death, as initiation rites such as these are often about facing deep-rooted fears. Whether this was on the minds of the builders of Karahan Tepe, we'll never know, unless, of course, the site gets excavated and evidence emerges. From now, we can only speculate. Another aspect that grabbed Andrew's attention was the fact that the parallel rows appeared to be serpent-like, weaving up or down the main hill or from the main enclosure. In his initial report, Andrew stated, "It's even possible that these zigzagging pairs of stones making up the stone avenues located on the northern, eastern sides of the tepe signify the path of snakes, which are seen to descend like living energy into the valley below." This idea is given credence through the fact that carving on the stones seems directed up the hill, as if the direction of movement is downwards through the various sets of gateways. After coming to this conclusion, Andrew dreamt of snakes, their tails tied together, each one trying to break free of its bondage, all of them writhing about in the process. With this dream came the impression that the snakes represented the containment, flow, and energy of the stone's avenues at Karahan Tepe, an interesting concept if nothing else. Earth energy springs to mind, as it has been found in Avebury, Brittany and Cornwall that stone avenues mark the path of telluric earth energy currents, with a crossing point often at the center of the complex, which would naturally congregate on a hilltop. More research needs to be carried out to confirm this hypothesis, but with the serpent symbolism at such a remote site, it could even reveal the origins of geomancy and earth energy science. When they go back in September, they will have some equipment to take readings and dowsing rods to find out if this is the case.
A woman's skull, the oldest known human remains ever found in Antarctica, discovered lying on Yamaha Beach at Cape Sheriff in Antarctica's South Shetland Islands, has become one of the continent's biggest mysteries. No surviving documents have ever been discovered to explain how or why a young woman came to be in Antarctica during this era. But now, new evidence may have finally been found to solve the case. Antarctica is about 5.5 million square miles in size, and thick ice covers about 98% of the land. The continental ice sheet contains about 7 million cubic miles of ice, making up about 90% of the world's ice and 80% of its fresh water. Although Antarctica has a fascinating history of human activity in the region, it extends back only about 200 years. Indeed, the majority of what is known about Antarctica has been discovered in the last few decades. Remote, inaccessible, and hostile, Antarctica was the last continent to be discovered, and knowledge of the South Polar region was collected slowly. The real nature of Antarctica was shown for the first time as long as the 18th century by the second voyage of the English navigator, Captain James Cook. Mariners who followed Cook into high southern latitudes of the icy continent did so because of his reports of huge numbers of whales and seals. On the 16th and 17th of November, 1820, American seal hunter Nathaniel Brown Palmer, then 21 years old, commanded the 47-foot-long sloop Hero, which entered the Orleans Strait and came very close to the Antarctic Peninsula. Palmer and his men became the first Americans and the third group of people to discover the Antarctic Peninsula. While there, Palmer met Russian captain Thaddeus Bellingshausen on a major national expedition that circumnavigated Antarctica eastward. The highly controversial question of who was first to sight land in Antarctica has never been resolved. British, Russian, and US ships were all present in the Antarctic Peninsula area in the early 1820s when the first sightings occurred. However, the first documented landing of the continent was not until decades later, on January 24, 1895, when the Norwegian whaling ship Antarctic landed a party at Cape Adare on the northern Ross Sea. From the late 18th to the mid-20th century, whalers and sealers operated in the rich seas surrounding the continent. From the mid-20th century onwards, scientific investigation replaced whaling and sealing as the primary year-round human activity in Antarctica. These days, around 1,200 people spend the winter in Antarctica. All of these are scientists and their support staff. Yamana Beach is an ice-free beach located on the west coast of Cape Sheriff in the north extremity of the Ioannis II Peninsula, Livingston Island in the South Shetlands of Antarctica. Sometime in 1985, human remains were discovered by chance the remote Antarctic beach by Chilean biologist Dr. Daniel Torres. According to Torres, on the afternoon of January 7, 1985, I was doing a census of mammals and also collecting marine refuse on Cape Sheriff, Livingston Island. On the beach, I saw a big plastic container and an enormous plastic orange buoy. I went to the buoy first to collect it, and as I headed along the beach, I noticed that among the very dark volcanic stones, there was one very white stone. But when I got closer, I saw that on the surface of the stone there was a series of lines that looked like a human skull. Obviously, I stopped and went up closer, and I was able to establish that it was a human cranium, half buried in this very thick volcanic sand, 40 meters away from the shore. I started very slowly separating the pebbles until I could pull out the top part of the cranium, and as the upper jaw bones were missing, I was looking for the other remains until I found them. Subsequent analysis of the skull at the Chilean Antarctic Institute revealed that it belongs to a young woman of 21, at the most. But who was she, and what was she doing in this remote spot? In January 1987, part of a human femur was found inland from Yamana Beach, and in January 1991, another part of a femur was found close proximity to the site of the earlier 1987 find. It was later revealed that the remains were of an indigenous female from southern Chile, who is believed to have died between 1819 and 1825. This makes the woman's bones the oldest known human remains ever found in Antarctica. But how did she get there? The traditional canoes of the indigenous Chileans could not possibly have managed such a long voyage through extremely rough seas. Fascinatingly, the girl's dates match up with the first known landings on Antarctica, though the location of the discovery was unusual, at a beach camp made by sealers. Female sealers were absolutely unheard of at the time. One theory is that the girl was an indigenous guide, translator, or navigator to the sealers traveling from the northern hemisphere to the Antarctic islands. But women taking part in such expeditions to the far south in the early 19th century was unlikely, though not impossible. Another much darker theory is that the girl was taken by force from her home in what is now southern Chile by sealers, and abandoned in the area where her remains were found 175 years later. Perhaps we will never know. There are no surviving documents explaining how or why this young Chilean woman came to be in Antarctica at this time. Her bones marked the start of human activity on Antarctica and were a hugely significant discovery for archaeology. But they are also of vital importance to the history of Antarctica as a whole, as they could be proof that Chile, which lies about 620 miles away from Antarctica, made the first known landings on Antarctica. It must be added that this is disputed in some quarters. Some researchers believe that in 1819, officers, soldiers, and seamen of the storm-damaged Spanish ship San Telmo, the flagship of a Spanish naval squadron bound for Peru, may have been the first people to land on Antarctica. If any crew members survived the initial sinking of the San Telmo north of Livingston Island and managed to get to Antarctica, they would have been the first humans in history to reach the continent. Indeed, some remnants and signs of wreckage were later said to have been found on Livingston Island in the South Shetland Islands by the English Captain William Smith, on board of Brig Williams, who arrived at the island of Livingston in October of the same year. The Antarctic Treaty System was first signed in 1959, but in 1998, a protocol on environmental protection was added stating that Antarctica is to be a natural reserve, devoted to peace and science, and forbids all activity relating to the Antarctic mineral resources, except as is necessary for scientific research. But significantly, this is the part of the treaty that could come under some review in 2048, 50 years after it was signed. On that date, the prohibition on mining resource extraction could be changed or scrapped completely. According to Klaus Dodds, professor of geopolitics at Royal Holloway University of London, there is a huge political storm coming connected with Antarctica. Lots of people just don't understand that there's a darker side to Antarctica. What we're seeing is great power politics play out in a space that a lot of people think of as just frozen wastes. The reason 2048 looms large is because if certain countries feel that the prohibition on mineral exploitation is no longer to be respected, people worry that the whole thing could unravel. 7 nations laid overlapping claims on Antarctic land when the treaty was adopted: Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the UK. The treaty holds all these claims in place and prohibited any new ones from being established. The treaty also puts any expansions to territorial claims to Antarctica on hold, but the big players, usually China and Russia, are thinking about this particular episode around 2048 and planning ahead. Of course, when human remains like the Chilean girl or objects are found in the ice, it ignites feelings of territorial naturalism. If Chile could use these remains to demonstrate that it had people living in Antarctica earlier than other nations making land claims, well, then they would be in a much stronger position in negotiations. A number of countries are now subtly trying to help their claims in Antarctica in differing ways, such as financing scientific research, historical investigation, and constructing research bases around the continent. It looks like the future of this remote icy continent may be more complicated and controversial than anyone could have ever imagined.
Archaeologists are preparing to launch the 3rd major excavation of an important site on the Jiroft Plain in the Halil River of southeastern Iran. The Konar Sandal remains were exposed after flooding in 2001 near Jiroft in Iran. Sheltering by towering, rugged mountains on 3 sides, this hidden jewel was revealed to be a sprawling Bronze Age urban settlement built by a magnificent kingdom whose existence had been previously excluded from the annals of history. The discovery led some experts to hypothesize that the long-lost Jiroft culture was actually the cradle of civilization before the emergence of Sumer or Mesopotamia. The excavated area in Iran's Kerman province has been named Konar Sandal. Its central feature is a pair of massive burial mounds separated by a distance of approximately 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers, which have been designated as Konar Sandal A, north, and Konar Sandal B, south. The site is located near Jiroft in southeastern Iran. Beneath Mound A, archaeologists found a stone structure they believed was used for religious purposes. Under Mound B, they found the remains of a 2-story fortified citadel anchored to a base that covered more than 33 acres, 13.5 hectares. At the foot of the mounds, deeper digs have revealed the presence of many smaller buildings, and it's believed that similar structures will eventually be unearthed in the space between the 2 mounds and elsewhere in the subterranean surrounding environment. In addition to the excavated structures, Konar Sandal has also yielded a plenitude of stunningly attractive and finely crafted artifacts, revealing the existence of a culturally sophisticated people who created and resided in an indisputably advanced society. Unlike the first 2 explorations, which were carried out by international teams, this new excavation will be strictly an Iranian affair, sponsored by the country's Research Institute of Cultural Heritage and Tourism. The demarcation project is aimed to determine the legal boundaries of the prehistorical site, explained the Kerman provincial tourism chief, who referred to the Konar Sandal site as one of the most important Bronze Age cities in Southwest Asia. This is a strong contention, but in fact this assessment may be unduly modest. The first section of the Jiroft Plain site and necropolis was discovered in 2001. Heavy flooding of the Halil River washed away tons of topsoil that had previously covered it, exposing a complex of ancient tombs no one had ever expected to find. Impressive hauls of Bronze Age jewelry, ceramics, tools, drinking cups, board games, and a variety of decorative items inlaid with semi-precious stones were recovered from the unearthed cemetery. Unfortunately, the initial discoverers were looters and antiquities black marketers who stole and sold many valuable artifacts before law enforcement and the military finally arrived to secure the site. After this initial discovery, the first official excavation at Jiroft began in 2003 under the leadership of the Iranian archaeologist Dr. Youssef Majidazeh. It ended in 2007, and he published his team's findings shortly thereafter. Based on radiocarbon dating, the archaeologists concluded that the Jiroft civilization that built the integrated urban complex had reached the peak of its power and prosperity at around the year 2500 BC. However, signs indicated that initial construction on the complex may have begun as long ago as the 5th millennium BC. During this excavation, and during another that was launched in 2014, archaeologists continued to find many valuable and intriguing artifacts inside the mounds and beneath the surrounding landscape. Most notably, they also found 4 tablets inscribed in 2 different languages, one of which was composed entirely of geometrical figures and could not be compared to anything that had been found before. So, just how significant was the discovery of this long-lost, literate kingdom in a bleak, desolate area of Iranian desert? Significant enough to throw the identification of Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization into question. Jean Perrault, a French archaeologist with previous excavation experience in Iran, was invited to inspect the site and its contents during the earliest stages of the first excavation. When asked to share his impressions, he stated the following: "An area we formerly regarded as resided only by nomads and their cattle was the heart of an incredibly advanced civilization. In this area, people lived with a social hierarchy. These people had an explicit view of the world, which distinguishes them from the Sumerians. Henceforth, we must consider Jiroft as the origin of civilizations and refer to all other civilizations as pre- or post-Jiroft civilization." There may be a bit of hype in this statement, since Sumerian civilization can be traced back at least as far, if not farther, than the Jiroft civilization to the 5th and 6th millenniums BC. But given that Mesopotamia and southern Iran are separated by only 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers, there exists the possibility that the Jiroft civilization shared a common ancestor with the Sumerians, and that perhaps the two split following the chaos, confusion, and destruction caused by the great floods that occurred at the end of the last ice age. At the very least, it's reasonable to assume that the peoples of Mesopotamia would have interacted with their Jiroftian neighbors to the east, perhaps to a significant enough extent that each culture was influencing the development of the other. In fact, many of the artifacts discovered at Konar Sandal are decorated with mythological imagery that seems to link its culture with that of Mesopotamia. The Jiroft civilization specialized in the creation of pottery using a semi-precious mineral known as chlorite, and examples of this pottery containing strikingly similar iconography have been found at various archaeological sites throughout the Middle East and Asia, including sites identified with Bronze Age Mesopotamia. Different interpretations of the exact identity of the lost Jiroft civilizations have been offered. Dr. Majid Zida believes that he and his colleagues may have discovered the site of the legendary land of Aratta, a glorious Atlantis-like kingdom from the Bronze Age that mysteriously disappeared from the pages of history in the far distant past. However, knowledge of Aratta comes primarily from Sumerian poems, which has led some to question whether such a place ever existed at all. An alternative theory suggests that the newly discovered Iranian civilization may be the ancient kingdom of Mahashi, which was located in southern Iran and is known to have been involved in conflicts with the Mesopotamian kingdom of Akkad in the 3rd millennium BC. A final answer to the riddle of the Jiroft civilization may never be found, but the fact that it existed at all is forcing archaeologists and historians to reassess everything they thought they knew about the primacy and importance of Mesopotamia to world history. Mesopotamia has not been diminished, but going forward, it may have to share the title Cradle of Civilization with its cousin from the east.